Once upon a time, there was a girl who loved to sleep. She used to slip off to sleep by the fireplace as her family were chattering, laughing around her. She used to slip to sleep during her work. When she was clearing out the cow barns, her mother would find her, straw in her hair, dreams in her eyes. She wasn't ill. She just really liked sleeping. She liked that moment of slipping off to other worlds, to countries unnumbered, uncounted, unimagined. She had a happy childhood. Wandering around the village, she had many friends. And yet, as her friends grew older, towards that time, that edge of adulthood, when they begin to think about marriage and men and children, she was too busy dreaming. One day she and her friends went to pick blueberries on the high slopes. It was a summer day, although there was a chill in the air, and mist tendrils wound their way around the girls' feet. As they were picking blueberries, they were laughing and chatting and eating and sharing. And after a while, the girl looked up and she saw further away there was a bush fat with blue berries. And so she walked a little way away from her friends. And then she saw another one, even bigger, with blue gems. And she wove her way a little bit further up the path. And then she knelt down and she began to pick. Some of them she ate, some of them she put in her basket. She became lost in that conversation between finger and thumb and berry and leaf and branch. When her basket was full, she looked up and realized that the mist had risen, and all she could see around her was thick, white mist. She looked around at the path. She called to her friends to make sure she was going the right way, but the mist seemed to keep her voice inside it, and she could hear nothing but the thick white silence. She went down the way she thought was right, and then she paused and went back a little bit, and then realized that she didn't know the way exactly, and she began to berate herself for being such a dreamer as the mist had risen, and she went the other way she thought might be the right way, and she wanted now to run, except she also knew that there were sharp edges to these cliffs, and if she ran in that white mist, she could run over them and fall. She walked on, calling as she went, knowing also that if she couldn't find her way back, when the high mountain chill came and the night came on, then it was unlikely that she'd survive until morning. So she walked on a little bit faster, with her heart drumming a little bit more in her chest, and then she realized that she was surrounded by something. There were beings. Was it her friends? At first she thought it might have been, but then she saw there were hooves and horns of these figures rising from the mist, and she remembered the stories that her grandmother had told her about demons in the mountainside. But then the wind rose and the mist parted, and she saw she was surrounded by a herd of deer, a stag, and hinds with their fawns. And her heart calmed, for she felt in company again. And she thought that if she couldn't find her friends, at least she'd stay with the deer, for they might be able to find a shelter, for they would know the ways of the mountain and the ways to keep safe. So she followed them when they went on. They didn't go fast, for they had to wait for the fawns, and it seemed sometimes when she stumbled, they waited for her to catch up. They went on. Sometimes the mist was thick and white, sometimes it was just in rags, and she saw places in the mountainside that she'd never seen before, tumbling waterfalls, great ravines, elder trees, ash trees, hawthorns, yews. Eventually they got to a great chasm in the rock, and the deer, without any hesitation, went inside the mountain, and the girl, with only a moment's hesitation, followed into a deep, dark tunnel. But it seemed as if somewhere at the end of the tunnel there was light flickering, And she walked, following the sound of the hooves of the deer and that flickering light. And eventually everything opened out and they came to a great cave, a great cavern. And in the cavern there was a great fire burning at the back. And beside that fire was an old man and an old woman. And in front of them there was a pool. Lit by the fire, it seemed to be filled with rainbow colours, cerise, vermilion, turquoise, scarlet, gold. The girl went in and she saw the old woman stand up and take a bucket and begin to milk one of the hinds. The girl went over to her, her hands open in supplication, and she said, "I'm sorry to come upon you like this, but I'm lost on the mountain, and could I stay here the night? The deer have led me here. I just need a place to stay until the morning." The woman looked at her. She had lines scored deep in her face, in her skin. Her eyes were dark grey pools. It seemed as if the girl could see the back of the mountain. The woman turned to the man and said something in a guttural language the girl didn't understand, and then she turned back to the girl and said, "No, you cannot. You cannot stay here one night, for this is a place. No, you cannot. You cannot stay here one night, for this is another cave and another place. And if you stay here, you must stay a year and a day, and you must serve us, for we are old and we could use the help." A year and a day? When you're young, a year and a day is like forever. The girl thought of all the things that she needed to do, the promises that she'd made to her friends, her sisters, the little ones that she would miss growing up, and also what people would think of her. Whether she lay dead on the mountainside or had run off to seek her own adventures, what would they think if she didn't come back? She didn't want to stay for a year and a day in a dank cave. But she also didn't want to go back onto the mountainside, and if truth be told, I don't think she wanted to leave the cave just yet either. And so she looked at the old woman and she said, "Yes, I will. Okay, I will stay for a year and a day and serve you in your work." The old woman nodded, gave her the skin of a deer and a bowl of soup, and the girl lay down and fell asleep and did not dream. When she woke up, sun was coming into the cave through a gap in the back that the girl had not seen the night before. And the woman gave her oats for breakfast and then gave her her work. She was to go out through that gap and gather herbs in the meadow that she would find. And so she went, and there was a great meadow, and there was wild mint and bog myrtle and thyme and golden asphodel, and she began to gather the herbs until she had an armful. And she took the herbs back to the old woman. The old woman showed her how to bind the herbs and lay them to dry. And then she showed her how to take those bundles, those dried bundles, and throw them to the flames so that the aromatic smoke would rise up to what was in the cauldron above. Milk, deer milk. And the woman showed her how to stir and wait and stir and wait until that milk came together into something like cheese, like crody. And the woman took a slatted spoon and lifted up that cheese and passed it to the old man. And the old man took it, but he didn't eat it. He began to mould it like clay. But he wasn't looking at it, he was looking at that rainbow pool. And he seemed to be making figures that he saw in the pool into that deer's milk, into that crody. And as the girl watched, the light from the back of the cave became more golden as the sun began to set. And when the sun set, it streamed fully into the cave in a deep gold, and the man stood up and he took those figures and he held them up to the sunlight, the setting sunlight, and they took on all sorts of colours of the world, reds and greens and golds. And then the man took the figures out through the gap and held them up, and the birds came. The small ones, the sparrows, the swifts, the pine martins, the big ones, the eagles, the falcons, the crows, the pigeons, the doves. They took those figures and they flew off with them. The same thing happened. Day, night and day. The girl gathered the herbs. She bound them. They made the crowdie. They gave it to the man. The man made the figures and held them up to the birds, and the birds took them. At first the girl thought their job was to feed the birds with these strange stories of cheese and milk, but then she realized that there was something else, that what they were making in that cave was dreams, without anybody telling her. It seemed as if the knowing came up through her body, and she realized that they were making dreams, and the birds were taking them away to the whole world, dreams of bliss and horror, dreams of pain and truth. Time passed, and the girl herself began to dream. She didn't dream of far-off lands as she had dreamt when she was in her village. Instead, she dreamt of where she was. She dreamt of picking the mint and feeling that aroma between her fingernails, and she dreamt that song of the mint, and she dreamt she could hear the song of the thyme and the golden asphodel. She dreamt that the walls of the cave were speaking to her in ancient stony whispers, and she dreamt that she could hear the music of the fire as it consumed the wood and warmed the room. And time circled round day and night and day and night until the girl almost forgot that she had a family. Every day, the gathering, the drying, the making of the cheese, and the dream sculpting. Until one day the old woman said to her, "A year and a day has passed, and you have done your work." And it took the girl a while to remember what she meant, and then the woman seemed to be waiting for something. And the girl realized that she was waiting for her to go. And after a while she realized that she needed to leave, and she looked around. She didn't have anything to gather, for she had come with nothing. And so she gave a bow to the old man and the old woman, and they nodded to her. And the old woman said, "You have done your work well, and we thank you for it. Follow the deer now, and you will, if you wish it, be rewarded." And so the girl followed the deer out through that deep, dark tunnel, out back onto the mountainside. And the strange thing was that it wasn't morning as she had thought it was. No, it was dusk. It was the same kind of time as she had gone into that tunnel. The moon was rising and the stars were coming out. But this time the girl wasn't afraid, and she followed the deer. She followed the deer underneath the wheeling stars through the night. She thought that they would take her down, but they didn't seem to be taking her down towards the village, rather along ridges and edges of mountains that she'd never seen before. And eventually they did go down. But when they did, they came to a great beach with surf beating upon the sand, grey and blue. And it had been so long since the girl had seen that light, that water, that she would have walked straight in to swim, but the deer seemed to be bunching around her as if she was to wait for something. And she looked as they were looking, and eventually she saw something, and then realized it was a boat, a wooden boat coming towards them on the waves. And as that boat came closer, she realized that there was a single sailor, and that sailor had rich jewels at his throat and on his hands. And when the sailor leapt out onto the sand, he knelt to her and he said, "Is it you, I have dreamed of you for a year and a day, and I have sworn to my father that I would prove that you are as real as the sand is dry and the sea is wet. And I know it sounds like madness, for you don't know me and I have not spoken to you before, but I would ask if you would marry me, for I am a prince of a far off land, rich and fertile, and I would offer you my hand. And the girl looked at him. She had not seen him before. She had not even dreamt of him, for she'd been too busy dreaming of the mint and the thyme and the rocks and the fire and the flames. But there was something in his eyes that reminded her of the song of the mint, and there was something in his voice that reminded her of the flickering of the flames, and she felt a response deep in her belly. And as she looked at him, she realized that this was a great gift she was being offered. And yet she also realized that if she went with him, she would always be dead in her mother's heart. And so she said to him, I would marry you. I will marry you. But I have given a year and a day to that old man and old woman in the cave, and I would ask for a year and a day to myself before I follow my fate. So if you want to marry me, go back to your father, the king, and tell him that you have found me, and I am as real as the sand is dry and the water is wet, and you will come for me in a year and a day, and then yes, I will marry you if we both still wish it. The man looked at her, and he said, I will come back and ask again. And so he left in his boat, he went across the seas, and the girl turned to the deer and said that she wanted to go home. And so they showed her the way. It was nearer than she thought, and when she got to the village there were shouts and great rejoicing, and she was asked for her story again and again, and her mother and father and sisters all embraced her. And when she told them her story, that she'd been lost on the mountainside, and about the old man and the old woman, they understood that she'd been lost. And more than that, her words seemed to blur and couldn't quite be heard, but they were glad, of deep gladness to have her back, and they fed her and they told her all the news, and she went back to sleep in her own room. And she lived happily, catching up with everything in the village for a year and a day. And she discovered the marriages and the births and those who had passed on. Only one thing troubled her, and that was that during the nights she dreamt dreams of such richness and strangeness that when she woke up they seemed like a burning ember on her tongue, and she wanted to speak them. But somehow she must not have had the right words, for it seemed as if when she spoke them the words blurred and couldn't quite be heard. After a year and a day, she bid farewell to her mother and her father and her sisters, and though they grieved to see her go again, there was something in their eyes that told her they understood. She went down at dawn to the edge of the village, and there the stag was waiting for her, and this time she mounted and she rode that stag back to the beach, and then she embraced him and he walked away, and she watched the seas. She watched the sea for the whole day and wondered if she had been a fool to turn away that offering. But just as night was beginning to fall, she saw a prick of something on the horizon, and then she saw a boat, and in that boat was a sailor, and the boat was coming closer and closer, and when it reached her, the prince jumped out, and he said to her, "Is it now time? Do you wish to marry me?" And she said yes. And so she went with the sailor in his boat, and they went across the seas, and there, in time, she married him, and in time they became king and queen of that kingdom. And as she became queen, she also became able to speak, of what came to her in her dreams. And eventually she taught that land the secrets of sleep and the wisdom of dreaming. She taught her husband, she taught her children, she taught the palace, and she taught the people. And eventually that land became one of the wisest lands that there ever has been or will be.